Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks, Eric, for the opportunity to share a little bit of what I think is a personal story I'm going to tell, a little bit about some of the different field experiences I've had doing research, really with, I think, the same populations that many of you work with in your programs. And I've learned a few things along the way that have made it easier to do some of the difficult things I've sometimes been faced with doing. And I'll be eager to hear how this lines up with. Whoop! I'm trying to navigate down here. Let me just see if I can get this going. There we go.
There you go.
Good. And I'll be interested to see how some of the things I've learned along the way in doing my work, you've learned or not learned as you've been doing your work and your own journeys. So I want to give you 3 examples of research projects I've learned a lot from over the years. And each one sort of posed a set of challenges to me that I'll tell you about, and I'll tell you not much about the research itself, but more about what I learned from trying to do it and working with the people involved. So the first one is called Comparative Ethno-Historical Studies of Literacy, and I'll unpack that a little bit for you in a minute. But I should say before going into it, when I came out of graduate school, a freshly trained field researcher, I had 2 guiding principles that I sort of took in my bag of tricks with me. And I thought, well, that's really all I'm going to need. But as you'll see, those things were more complicated than I learned initially. But the 2 principles I sort of took with me were have respect for the communities you're engaged with and have respect for the individuals you're engaged with. And I'm sure many of you have those axioms too and bring them into the classroom or into your programs. But these were things I took with me as I went into the field. Before I talk about these comparative studies of literacy that I did, let me just tell you very quickly about the dissertation I did many years ago working with a tribe in rural West Africa called the Vai that had invented their own writing system. And I was part of a project that was looking into this because it was quite unusual for literacy to be invented rather than borrowed. And that was of great interest to us. And I learned a lot working on that project. But there was, other than adapting to a totally different culture and way of life and language and writing system, it was relatively straightforward for me to do. Because literacy was just kind of coming out of the culture. But then after I finished that project, got my degree, and went out into the world to do research, I wanted to get involved in studying literacy development in communities that had much more complicated origins. And there were 3 of them that I worked with, one at a time. The first one was in Alaska that I called Seal Bay, not the real name of the town. But it was an indigenous community, and what was interesting about literacy there was that it was brought in at first by the Russian-American company, which, as you know, was an 18th century Russian commercial expedition that not only brought literacy to Alaska, it brought commercialization of fishing and hunting, credit, money, all kinds of things. But literacy was an important part of it. And so I thought of literacy as sort of being imported into the culture from outside. The second community I worked in that I called Newton in my publications about it was a community of Hmong that resettled into the west coast of the United States. And by and large, the Hmong immigrants, at least the first waves that I was working with, did not bring literacy with them, but they were sort of transplanted into the belly of the literate monster. So that had a very different kind of cultural origin for literacy. And the third community I looked at, I called Pleasantville, and it was a migrant community in the Pacific Northwest, partially migrant, partially settled out, and it was kind of, in many ways, an intermediate case in terms of the origins of literacy, because some people brought literacy with them in Spanish from Mexico. Others acquired it only after they were here. And anyway, I did sort of in-depth work in each of these communities. I was particularly interested in how literacy and education developed among the adult populations, and particularly how the socio-historical context I was talking about really structured the process of literacy development. I don't want to tell you too much more about that, but I do want to tell you about some of the challenges that I faced.
Steve, before you go, can you go back to the previous slide?
You bet.
Sure. I just want to point out that I think that one of the important implications of this kind of research, sometimes people wonder about, cultural research or social cultural research around literacy, but I think this type of work was really important because it helped us understand how we can tailor literacy programs and language programs to different immigrant communities coming to the States, right? So rather than kind of having a one-size-fits-all, we've got this curriculum, we've got these textbooks, and we're just going to give them to everybody. This type of work helps us really understand what knowledge people brought with them, what expectations they brought with them, what kind of habits they brought with them. And historically, I think it was a big shift in thinking about literacy. So rather than, really thinking about it as a generic thing, thinking about the specific things that people do.
Thanks, Eric. That's really great comment. So the thing that was difficult to do for me in this work was really tuning into the culture and the history of the communities, and that sort of broke down for me as I did it in three sort of sub-challenges. The first was just trying to understand the power and the positions of everybody involved in the situation I was immersed in doing research. And later on, qualitative researchers talked about the need for bracketing the positions of everybody involved, whether it's the researchers, the funder of the research, the community members of the community, the different audiences that researchers write and talk for, everybody really involved in this. They all have their vantage point, they all have their privileged positions, they all have their points of view, and it's really important to understand those and how your own point of view sort of gives you access, but yet to some kinds of knowledge and blinds you from acquiring other kinds of knowledge. this is when you're doing research, just like when you're teaching. Um, you don't, you know, it's just not a simple matter of objectivity and methodology. You really have to take the different positions of where people are coming from and differences in power that you have to really understand the dynamics of what you're seeing right in front of you. And once I got comfortable, you know, thinking about my experiences in the field in that way, difficult things got a lot easier to do. Um, the second challenge I faced, and this one was really in the Alaska site, was that I had been trained as a qualitative researcher in what was often called moral relativism. It's really important for me going in and into a community as a guest, as an outsider, as an observer, not to make judgments about what I'm seeing, just to make descriptions about it. That's kind of the textbook approach to doing field research. That sounds really good when you're a graduate student. And in some situations, that seems relatively uncomplicated to do. But I wound up in some really ethically complicated situations in the village in Seal Bay, particularly around issues of alcoholism and child abuse, or what I believed was child abuse, physical violence. And it was very hard for me to take. I was totally unprepared for how to respond to that. Should I just ignore it and, you know, and just observe it or not observe it or note it or not note it? And I really found out that moral relativism, as important as it is in many ways, has its limits. And we as human researchers, you know, can run into those boundaries sometimes, which raise a, you know, a huge variety of ethical conflicts, some of them very profound. And I'm not sure I quite found my way out of some of them. And you know, teachers, we run into those also, as I'm sure many of you have. The third kind of challenge.
Wait 1 second, Steve. I think that's a really important point to kind of linger on for a second, because as you were saying that, I was thinking of my own experience, particularly around childcare, right? So what I would deem as abuse, the parents, immigrant parents that I was working with would not deem it as abuse, you know? And so I always felt like working within the States, I was a mandated reporter, right? I was legally obligated to report something. And then I can think of a couple situations where I was really kind of debating with myself, is this an example of abuse that I'm a mandated reporter, or from their perspective, is this not abuse? And then is that okay to kind of explain it as their perspective versus kind of my perspective and what the state's perspective might be? And I think it gets really, really tricky. I think if you get to be intimate enough with the community that you're working with, that they're going to share things with you that they may not share to other people, I think you have more of these conundrums. If you don't know your students at all, it's never going to come up. But if you get to know your students pretty well, I think it's more likely that these things are going to be raised.
That's absolutely the case. You know, I wasn't a mandated reporter as a researcher. And that would have been a nice, simple tool to have sort of forced my my hand or my decision about what to do. But it can be, you know, problematic in other kinds of ways because, you know, certain things come out, particularly in the context of substance abuse, um, things you see and hear, and you're not quite sure what to do with those,
Hmm.
because the kind of understandings that you have with people, even people you know pretty well, are very, become challenged
Right.
by that change. Anyway, I just wanted to mark that. The third challenge I got, was really finding out that sharing, I talked about, bracketing different positions and the different things that people know who are in those different positions. But then that led to a third challenge, which had to do with the politics, really, of sharing knowledge between people who are in different positions. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I think I've already gotten myself out. I've already challenged myself here with so many challenges, keeping my slides straight. What I wanted to do now was quickly, for the first challenge, the power and positions within what I'm calling research enterprises, just quickly point out that the researcher, that in this case that was me and a colleague, we had our positions in the field, but our funding agency, a federal agency, had their position and their power and their influence. And so did the audiences for the research we were going to report out, our colleagues, programs who were serving the village that we were studying, obviously the residents in the village themselves, as well as the collective community itself. They all had their interests, they all had their positions, and we needed to do our bracketing for all of these different groups and positions. So let me stop there and get maybe a first waypoint for discussion. And I just threw up a couple questions for you all to look at your own experience with. And if these aren't questions that resonate with you right now and you have other questions, those are fine. Eric, you've thrown in some good ones already, but I just wanted to stop and not put too many logs on the fire at once here. Do these points, these challenges I ran into in doing field work resonate with you as practitioners?
So as I said at the top of the hour, you can either raise your virtual hand and I can unmute you, or in the question area, you can respond and then I'll share it with everybody that way. I know some of these are maybe a little bit longer form answers than we've had to some other questions. So if you want me to unmute you, I'll do that. And if not, I'll wait to see what some of your answers are in the question area. I think, as Steve was saying, both as practitioners or as program directors, you may not be in the classroom with students on a daily basis, but you're making decisions about how the program's being run and need to think about these issues about who the community is, the place of the organization within a community, how you connect to students in that way. Steve, I always say it's, when you're in a classroom, you always know what wait time looks like, right? You ask the question and you can see that your students are thinking or looking at their notes, and you just presume that that's going on when you're doing a webinar. You have to think
Yep.
about what wait time looks like in a webinar.
Sure.
I think that, I think this idea, for me, I think the idea of respectful community engagement is really essential. And I always keep questioning myself because I know that I don't want it to be my assessment of whether I'm being respectful or not, right? I feel like it's my community partners that are going to be the ones that determine whether I've been acting in a respectful way.
So let me just make a couple comments on
Okay.
things I did to, in trying to understand the community um, as a step towards respectful engagement. One of the things that was very different for me as an outsider in Seal Bay, where I went right after I had been worked in, a village in West Africa, I was the first white man ever to live in the village in Africa where I was. And I was a novelty, a curiosity, all those, a source of great entertainment. Um, as I tried to engage with the community. But I didn't have any problem being an individual because I was a one of a kind, the first one like me, they thought, that they had seen. When I got to Seal Bay in Alaska, however, I had big historical footprints I was already walking in because of the history of outsiders in the village and in Alaska. And I was young with a big bushy black beard at the time, and people thought as an white outsider that I either had to be a village school teacher, because I sort of looked like village school teachers they'd had, or a Russian Orthodox priest, because the Russian American company brought the Russian Orthodox Church into the village as well. But I was neither of those things. But it took a long time for people to be able to see past those somewhat caricaturized or stereotyped views of who I was, to see me as an individual. And it took me, I had to really struggle to be myself in that way. And that was, a very powerful experience for, a young man trying to understand ethnicity and culture. Really from those kind of edges and margins. And so that was a source of learning. My power was also very limited because of that reason, and I had to, the bracketing of my own position in the field, recognize that I wasn't really I didn't have much power. And that was very interesting. And, cultural factors also really played into how I could engage with individuals. And I'll just give you one example of that. I grew up in as I imagine most of you did also, in a culture of when you don't know someone very well, what you want to do to get to know them is to sit down with them and talk with them. And you talk with them long enough until you're both really comfortable being able to sit in silence together. In the Cognac culture in Seal Bay, it was just almost diametrically opposed. The way you got to know someone was to sit in silence with them long enough until you were both comfortable to talk with each other. And I would try to go, when I was trying to interview people or talk to them about their life, I would go into their homes and we'd sit down, and I wanted to start talking so I could get to know them. And they wanted to be silent so they could get to know me. And that was quite a cultural gulf. And it took me a long time to appreciate how that was there.
I think, and that certainly, I think, has implications for enrollment in the U.S., right? So how do we manage events where students come to our programs or our schools and how quickly does that process take place, right? Like here you're in line, you sit down, you kind of quickly go through the paperwork, and then here's the phone number, and here's when the class starts. Nick points out that in our programs, we're often dealing with multiple communities at the same time. And doesn't this reality point to the importance of cultural competency in adult education, but not just one culture, many cultures, without defaulting to a stereotypical view of culture? I agree, Nick, and I think part of that is having patience and also listening, right? And possibly listening to the silence, right? And you may, sometimes we misunderstand what people say, but sometimes we misunderstand what they don't say, right? And I think that's a big thing too.
Yeah, well put. Absolutely right, in my experience.
So, Steve, do you maybe want to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about that third challenge. I think we've talked about these first two ones. So the third challenge is the one about sharing knowledge between people in different positions. And here I want to give credit to my dear colleague Harry Walcott, who's no longer with us, but he impressed me early in my career with this way of rendering the politics of sharing research findings. And he said everything you learn when you're doing research kind of fits into one of four pots, as you can see in this sort of 2x2 table. There's things you learn that for the people you're presenting it to is good news, and there are things that are bad news. There are things that are previously known by the people and things that were previously unknown. And each of these four cells, often has very different politics of sharing it back with the people you're doing research with. So, with the, previously known good news, the typical political reaction is, so what? We already knew that. Big deal. Thanks for reminding us, but that was a lot of time and money you spent doing, getting something we already knew. If it's previously known bad news, the politics shift a little bit, and people kind of get angry that you had to do all this research to tell them things they're not really very happy to hear. When you get to the previously unknown good news, everybody likes to report that back. And there's real danger, and care needs to be taken in reporting back previously unknown bad news. And I had examples, I think, that fell into each of these cells. And again, I'm just talking about Seal Bay in Alaska here for the sake of the example. In the previously known good news category, for example, telling people that they, as commercial fishermen, they were very successful, financially successful, and really doing well. That was sort of previously known good news. But nobody was terribly impressed hearing that from an outsider who'd come in and spent a lot of time there. For the previously known bad news, I would return to alcoholism and its negative effects on village life. That was hard to, as I said, hard to miss and hard to take as a researcher, and not really pleasant to feedback in community meetings for discussion. For previously unknown good news, I had a different view of literacy and educational development to offer them that really took into account the skills they had in the context that they needed to have them. People were very good, for example, at mathematical computations related to fishing boat navigation. And this was an era when that type of perspective, which is much more commonplace today, was really welcome news to the community, because they tended to hear from school officials about how weak their literacy and math skills were and how challenged they were by the educational system. This was a complementary view. So this was, I would say, previously unknown good news. And for the previously unknown bad news, what I had seen coming that I think a few people probably already saw as well, but by and large it wasn't anything people were talking or thinking much about, was there was a transformation happening in the commercial fishing industry in Alaska called limited entry fishing permits, which was really going to be market-based control and limitation of commercial fishing opportunities. And though it looked like this would, make the permits very valuable because they could be sold on the cash market, the bad news was really the negative effect this would have on the sovereignty of the native culture. And that proved to be the case in many respects over the years to come. And so that was really bad news coming as we were talking about it. Anyway, that's just sort of the way politics of sharing research findings maps out in different ways. And I wonder what experiences you've all had as program administrators or practitioners or possibly researchers yourselves, feeding data and findings back to various stakeholder groups in your communities.
Right, and
Have
so
you had to deal with these things?
so as before, you can either raise your hand or use the question area to respond to that. And then I think we'll just briefly, kind of pause here for that because we're already like 36 past the hour. But as people are kind of thinking about this for a second, I will say a couple years ago I did a needs analysis of adult education in the state, and the state was not very happy when I went back to them and said that they were providing service to probably 3 to 5% of the adults in the state that would benefit from adult education. They were not happy that I gave them a number and that there was a number that could circulate. So, I think sometimes, and I'm not sure what quadrant that I would put that on. I think depending upon who it was, I think it was like previously known bad news, but to actually put a number on it maybe moved it to the unknown bad news when I actually quantified it.
Right. Okay, well, this is just one way, I think, of illustrating and thinking about some of the community sensitivities that are involved in sharing research findings with them. I found Harry's scheme very useful. Let me move on to my next example study, which takes us really away from the community engagement issues into the individual level of engagement. And this is the project I want to talk about very briefly as a context for those issues is a longitudinal study of adult learning that I and colleagues spent nearly 10 years on. And let me just tell you a little bit about the study itself. It was a study of a random sample of adults in the Portland, Oregon area who were randomly sampled as high school dropouts, age 18 to 44 at the time we did the sampling, and we called this sample a panel, and then we followed the panel over nearly a decade, doing interviews, repeated interviews in their homes, skills assessment, all kinds of things, all kinds of data. We're not going to go into the weeds on that. But we followed individuals. Some of them were in adult education programs at the time the study started. Others weren't, but went in later as we followed them over time. Some never went into adult ed programs, and we kind of compared their trajectories and experiences and looked at the way in which adult education participation affected their lives. That was really the focus of the study. And to do this was what was difficult about this study was getting people to participate initially and then keeping them in the study over time. And we managed to keep over 90% in the study over all those years. And that was, I think it was, most people see that as difficult to do. And I think I learned some really important things in trying to do that, that have to do with respectful individual engagement. So let me share that with you a little bit. For recruiting and retaining participants in the study, what was really important, well, there were a couple things that were important. First of all, we did pay people each time we interviewed them for their time. But what was, I think, important about that was not just the economic benefit that gave them, but also the measure of respect that it conveyed. And that, I'm not sure I realized that at the time. I thought, oh yeah, if we pay people, that'll incentivize them, we'll get better participation rates. But it was really, what we learned was it was much more than just the money. It was the whole way we presented the research to the individuals. And that was, they were being paid not because we were interested in people like them that had problems like they do, and that's what our research was about, but really that they were experts in the problems that we wanted to learn about. And so we wanted to pay them for their time and their expertise. And this is a population that rarely was ever approached by anyone for anything in those terms. And so valuing their voices and opinions, and I think all of the interviewers involved in the study really worked very hard at valuing their voices and opinions. That really helped with the difficult thing of recruiting and retaining participants in the study. Another challenge we faced was confidentiality and anonymity, and I think these are things we all deal with as teachers and program administrators, and certainly researchers do as well. One of the things that we learned is we could not easily combine small group activities like focus groups or community meetings, things that I had used in the previous study I talked about. Those things really couldn't easily be combined with the individual approach we needed to take because of all the constraints on confidentiality and anonymity. We could not tell people, give people much confidence that their confidentiality would be maintained if there were other people participating in the study right there with them. And that was something of a bitter pill for me to swallow because I just loved the dynamics and the conversations that flowed out of small groups. But we had to do that differently and have a separate qualitative component in the study that from the more individually focused survey. And then the other challenge in this project was, again, the politics of giving individuals feedback. People we worked with and followed often asked us for our opinion about how they were doing, what did we think of their skills that we were assessing, did they get a test score, could we tell them what it was, and we struggled with what stance we should take on this. We did not want too much to influence people by what we thought or how we evaluated their life trajectories and circumstances, including their education and test scores. But on the other hand, they would often ask us directly, and we wanted to be supportive. It's hard to say, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that. So we had to really develop something that everyone could be comfortable with. And that's really not unrelated to the politics of sharing information that we were talking about just a minute ago with the 4 quadrants.
I also think, Steve, I also think that that's completely analogous to, or maybe potentially analogous to, the position that sometimes teachers or administrators are in when a student comes in and says, my goal is to pass my GED in 6 months, right? And from your perspective, the student is nowhere close to being able to do that in 6 months. So there's that tension between, what the student believes is kind of a reasonable or achievable goal for themselves, and then your own assessment of where they might be. You can't tell them, no, you're a grown-up. You can make you can set these goals yourselves, but you also don't want students having sort of unrealistic senses of what the education system looks like. Right.
So this can get us all into ethical dilemmas, I think. As a college teacher, I frequently have gotten into situations where my students' parents want to know things, and how their daughter or how their son is doing, or why they got such a poor grade in my class. And of course, we have FERPA regulations, and we can say, I'm sorry, I can't share that information with you. But those are the simple conflicts, or conflicts that have a simple way out. But there are many other ones. Yeah. Let me move on to the third study, and the final example, which was kind of a combination of both community engagement and individual engagement. This was a BTOP project I was involved with. BTOP stands for Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, and there were sort of hundreds of projects that grants were made for. Most of them were for building broadband infrastructure and connectivity. A few were actually for training and outreach to underserved populations, and that's what our BTOP project was all about. And we operated this project for 3 years in 7 states, and you know, primarily we were trying to push back on barriers of affordability, lack of digital literacy, and perceived lack often of relevance of technology to people's daily lives, needs, and aspirations. And in the 7 states, in various ways, we targeted low-income adults, often adult education populations, including immigrant communities. And we were trying to create learning environments so they could acquire digital literacy skills. And this had its own difficult things that had to be done. We wound up with about 125 different community technology centers in this project in a diverse set of settings, ranging from housing projects, schools, community-based organizations, prisons, homeless shelters, you name it. And this was not like one size fits all, put it into different places. We really decentralized the design and implementation of the project. So not even states, but really local communities involved in the project got resources from our BTOP project, and they were able to design the way they wanted to implement it. The 2 commonalities across the design were use of a self-directed learning package for digital literacy that was in computer labs, and that was paired with face-to-face volunteer tutoring and tutor training. All of those were the common elements, but how you turned that into a local digital literacy program was really up to the community. Overall, we served about 20,000 low-income learners, 2/3 of whom made measurable progress, and over 1,000 volunteers from the various communities took part and provided, as you can see in this slide, something like 50,000 face-to-face tutoring hours in these community labs. So that's a bird's eye view of the project. What some of the challenges were, again, recruiting and retaining participants in the study. In this case, they're really not just research participants, they're learners in programs. And the lesson I learned around that challenge is glossed by decentralization, but that's more than just a bureaucratic reality. It's really a recognition that allowing and empowering community partners to frame research and education in their subjects' lives and in their concerns, and valuing their leadership, their voices, their opinions. Whoa, does that make what otherwise would be almost an impossible task a viable one. And we saw some really, really creative strategies developed. Let me give you an example from Treme, which is the historical African American community in New Orleans. There, the program was installed in a Baptist church that had a food giveaway program going on. Every Sunday afternoon, families came, no questions asked, to get boxes of food that were collected from donors in the community and distributed out to people who needed them. The preacher in the church came up with the idea of advertising our digital literacy program on custom-made labels that were put on water bottles that were distributed with the food giveaway program. And that's how many, many people were recruited into the computer lab in the digital literacy program. It was remarkable to see. It was just, and this is one of many, many examples of local creativity. And what I learned from this was kind of, you know, scholars of the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression would say, duh. But this BTOP program itself was part of the ERA program, you know, that was created in the Obama administration in response to the Great Recession. And what was interesting about it was not a prescribed federal program that trickled down to the states and local levels and looked everywhere pretty much the same. It didn't have time to do that. It just, our project, like many of the projects, harnessed local creativity and enterprise to come up with some really extraordinary approaches to program design and implementation. I wish I had time to share more examples with you, but I think you get the idea from that one.
We have about 5 or more minutes, Steve, to kind of wrap up a little.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Okay. And
I think what I've got left really is what strategy, questions about what strategies you all may have used to actively engage communities you serve in designing and delivering your programs. As the lesson I learned in the BTOP project. And what resources do the communities you serve have that may be helpful to use in your programs? And I know many programs and instructors have learned how to harvest community resources in their programs. So I guess I want to end with just saying I started, if you remember, with 2 guiding principles: respectful community engagement and respectful individual engagement. And these turned into, with the lessons I somehow managed to learn over time, into 2 very helpful strategies for making it easier to do difficult things. And I'm going to stop there, saying we can do difficult things, and we've got lots of difficult things, I fear, ahead of us left to do. And I thank you all for your work and would love to hear any questions or discussion.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've got just a few minutes before people have to sign off. So Renee says that you've given her a lot of information to think about, and she thanks you. So as other people are chiming in, one of the things that it brought to mind was I worked on a project in Massachusetts with Somali, Cape Verdean, and Haitian families, and we worked with the parents to give them information that they could share with other parents, and we would give the parents the information, and then they would be the ones that would decide where they were going to go. So one of the first things we learned from the Cape Verdean community was every Saturday in Brockton, which has a large in Massachusetts has a large Cape Verdean population, they would go. Everybody went to this fish market. So the mothers in our project set a table up in front of the fish market so that they knew that's where they were going to get the mothers and fathers, because on that Saturday everybody went to the fish market, right? So
Right.
that's a decision that they needed to make because that's the information that they had that we would never have.
That's a great example.
All right, other thoughts or questions that people have? I mean, I think that maybe compared to some other webinars, these are kind of longer form things to think about, right? So how do you engage with the community respectfully, ethically, and productively? It's not a recipe, right?
No,
It's never going to be a recipe.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So other thoughts that folks have? Either you can type it in or I can unmute you. Or people just kind of like taking it in. So as I said, I'll distribute the PowerPoint of the PDF of the PowerPoint, and I'll also upload the archived version to the our YouTube channel. And also, I'm not sure if you all got the announcement, but Stephen's going to be our plenary presenter at at our spring conference in May. So he'll be talking about this and also working with hard to reach adults. So who are the populations out there that are difficult to get to? And you have to think about some of the ethical and logistical things that he spoke about in this webinar when you want to think about working with that population. If you have questions that come to mind, you can always certainly send them to me afterwards, or thoughts that you have, you can send them to me afterwards and I can distribute them to everybody that's signed up and also pass them along to Steve. And we have another webinar on Thursday about digital resources. Thanks, Kathy. Yes, Kathy's saying there's much to think about. Yes, indeed, I agree. So if you're not going to be online for Thursday, but we've got a webinar on Thursday about using digital resources with migrant and immigrant populations. And next week is our last one about of the fall, which is about health literacy. So I guess if there's no other questions, I think we can get all ready to sign off. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your Tuesday. And I hope that I see you either online for other webinars. Or if you've got ideas for a webinar, you can always send it to us at NJOL. You can either do it yourself and I can teach you how, or if you can't do it, I can try to find somebody that can. So Steve, thanks for sharing your, I think, really sincere and hard-learned lessons about doing this type of work.
Well, thanks, Eric, and thank you all for the work you do. And keep on doing it.